In this video, let us discuss about the composition of exports as well as about the policies of exports in India almost since the independence. First, let me explain you about how the exports varied from the beginning. In the beginning, jute and tea occupied the most important part of the Indian exports. If we divide the phase from the beginning as 1960-61, 1970-71, 2010 and 11, and we consider the most possibly important categories of exports of India from the beginning, they have been categorized as jute, tea, engineering goods, petroleum, gems and chemicals. Now, considering jute, it occupied the most important position in the Indian exports in 1960-61 with 21% contribution. Later on it continuously declined in its contribution, and in 70-71 it stood at 12.4%, and in 2010 and 11 it stood at almost as less as 0.2%. Next, tea, which actually stood at almost the second place in the Indian exports in the beginning in 1960-61, contributing 19.3% to the Indian exports. Later it declined to 9.6%. Later a much little better over the jute, but at as less as 0.3%. Then the engineering goods, which were actually less in 1960-61 in their contribution to the Indian exports with 3.4%, although the information was not available in 1970-71, but right now in 2010 and 11 they are contributing 27.1% by standing first among the contribution to the Indian exports. So engineering goods, now it is standing first. We can say from 2004 and 5 onwards, engineering goods are almost occupying the first place. From 2004 and 5 onwards, engineering goods are almost occupying the first place in their contribution to Indian exports. Next, petroleum. Actually, we don't know the data regarding the petroleum exports from India from 1960-61 and 70-71, but we can say the unavailability of data is because of we have been importing on a large scale in those years. From the 1973 petroleum shock in the global world, actually new markets emerged in the petroleum exports category, and India also has been one among such new exporters for petroleum products. So with that reason, by 2010 and 11, we are almost contributing in petroleum exports of India to 16.8%. So 16.8% is the contribution of petroleum products in the Indian exports in the year 2010 and 11. Next, gems and jewels. See, actually we have been exporting the raw materials, precious raw materials which will be useful in making gems and jewels in the beginning, and we have been importing the finished precious gems, especially from the countries like South Africa. In the previous video I told you that we didn't have the cutting edge technology which will facilitate the complete finishing of a gem, but later we imported the technology, and using the very precious raw materials we are having, we ourselves are producing the gems. So the export of gems also had some momentum, and in the 1970 and 71 it was at 2.9%, and the same export of gems and their contribution to the Indian exports was at 14.7% in 2010 and 11. Next, chemicals. Chemicals were also exported. We cannot say exact contribution of the chemicals to the Indian exports in 1960-61 as well as 70-71, but in 2010 and 11 the contribution of chemical exports in Indian exports was at 11.5%. See, With this we can understand that the exports of India in the beginning were directly dependent on traditional and primary products like jute and tea. But later on, the composition of exports of India is getting a diversified basis, and we were also exporting engineering goods, petroleum products, gems, chemicals. Although I didn't mention here, there are many other exports in the present years which are contributed in the exports of India. They are ready-made goods, cotton as well as yarn fabrics, and fish and fish contents, and also along with them we can also consider a mere contribution, 0.9% contribution in the Indian exports, that is rice items were also sometimes exported. In 2010 and 11 the export of rice items contributed to very less, 0.9% in the Indian exports. So in this way the export base of India has been diversifying and increasing. Among all of them, the engineering goods in 2010 and 11 stood at 27.1%, contributing nearly $68,780 million. $68,780 million. So this is the contribution by the engineering goods to the Indian exports. We ranked the engineering goods in the first place in the contribution of exports in 2010 and 11, second to the petroleum, and third to the gems, and almost fourth to the chemicals. Now let us go through which policies facilitated for such a diversification in the Indian exports, and what policies have been implemented by Government of India in its foreign trade policies, especially for exports. So such a different composition, such a change in the composition of exports is coming. So let us check now. Actually, we can divide the phase of export policies of India into three phases. We can divide the export policies as well as export experiences of India into three phases. They are, one is from 1952 to almost 1965 and 66. We can say even up to the oil shock of 1973. Then the second phase, later the 1973 oil shock, and from then to almost 83, that is a decade from 1973. A decade from 1973. The third phase, we can say from the second half of the sixth plan. From the second half of the sixth plan, we can say the third phase started. Now, first of all, let me explain you on what basis these three phases were categorized. See, in the previous classes I told you there was a restriction on exports in India. We can say a passive export policy was existing in India in the beginning. What may be the reason for such a passive export policy means our previous bitter experiences just prevented us from trading with the foreign countries. And moreover, to prevent the export of goods, because we are having the more and more domestic demand. When we are having more and more domestic demand, if we export the same to other countries, here the cost may increase or here the availability may come down. So instead of selecting some goods and prohibiting their export, totally our policy aimed at prohibition of exports. We cannot say complete prohibition because some exemption was given to iron ore and such metals, which gave us some important foreign exchange earnings. And our traditional exports, jute, tea, sugar, etc., they continued in exports. But anyway, this period 1952 to 1965 and 66, we can say a passive export policy up to the third 5-year plan was continued. So I told you, for increasing the availability of goods for more and more domestic consumption. Second one, by imposing taxes. We controlled the exports. But from the third plan onwards, the scenario is changing because we understood that export earnings and the foreign exchange earnings through exports are compulsory and necessary for the development of country. So almost from the beginning of the third plan, a shift towards encouraging the exports was observed in the Indian foreign trade policies. Moreover, another reason why we didn't have an interest on exports was during this period, that is, we can say the period post the Second World War. The period post the Second World War is marked by export pessimism. What is this export pessimism? See, usually there will be different countries in the global world. There will be developed countries and there will be developing countries. Either for technology or for support, these developing countries will depend on the developed countries and such necessities will be imported. Now, the developed countries which cannot produce some undermined goods, such goods can be exported from the developing countries. But usually what is happening, the developed countries are not showing interest on the goods to get import from these developing countries, which means imports of developing countries or exports to developed countries. And at the same time, exports of developing countries should be the imports of developed countries. Then only there will be a balance. But the developing countries are getting imports from the developed countries. So these developing countries are paying to developed countries. But in return, these developed countries are not encouraging to get the goods from these developing countries, and thus they also give some money to the developing countries. But it is not going on. So the developed countries are benefiting, but the developing countries are not benefiting. The reason is developing countries will not have a good technology available in their hands. When there is a lack of technology, we cannot expect a good quality at a reasonable cost from the developing countries. So these developing as well as underdeveloped countries, they are producing goods of inferior quality, and these developed countries are not showing any interest on such inferior quality goods. But if the developed countries are not encouraging the developing as well as underdeveloped, how they improve their technology or how they get some earning through the foreign exchange so that they can use it for their development, it is not possible. Why the developed countries are doing so? Because they are not showing some interest on such inferior qualitated products. They want a better quality. And so they are depending on their neighbored developed countries for trade. Now, that is called as the export pessimism. This belief is called as export pessimism. But this export pessimism just lagged with the oil shock of 1973. Usually the countries continued in trading with some particular countries, either in petroleum or anything. But the 1973 petroleum shock gave a blow to the global world that we should not continue trade with some particular countries, but we should have an idea of diversifying our trade base with other countries. So when one source may not supply us, the alternative source will supply us. And this thought helped the developing countries and underdeveloped countries to become a market base for these developed countries. Because just now I told you what the developed countries thought. We should have an alternate market base for trading. When we are continuing our trade with some particular countries, for example petroleum products, they are continuing with OPEC countries. Now let us have a shift. Let us have a major export from the OPEC countries, but at the same time let us have some exports, some imports in the form of petroleum products from other countries. If we import from other countries, when these OPEC countries are not supplying, the alternative source will supply. So this created a new base for new markets for the developed countries, and that new market base has been the shift towards imports to the developed countries from developing as well as underdeveloped countries. And that shift in the thought by the developed countries helped developing as well as underdeveloped countries, and India has also got such a benefit. So almost from 1961-66 and especially from 1973 onwards, there was a good demand for the Indian goods in the global market. Next, the second phase is later 1973 and 83 decade, which was especially marked by improvement or increase in the exports of engineering goods as well as petroleum products. Now this 73 and 83 decade, many export promotion schemes were announced by the government of India in its foreign trade policies. With such export promotion schemes, exports from India had a rise. Moreover, in 1966, the value of rupee was devalued by 36.5%. In the previous video you can find that is a tactical decision taken by the government of India. If the value of rupee was devalued, imports become costlier, so imports will be restricted and exports will give more and more profits with the devaluation of rupee. So there may be some encouragement to the exports. And with that devaluation of rupee, exports slowly gained some momentum, and in addition to that, other export promotion schemes like giving away the import licenses for good exporters so that they can import capital goods which will help in the production of exports. And moreover, such imports will be given at a rebated rate by giving concessions on taxes, so that the taxes which were given concessions will be reducing the cost of production and will make the goods, export goods of India competitive in the global market. Such export promotion schemes just given a momentum to the exports of India, and thus in the just previous screenshot you observed a tabular form where I gave composition of exports, the change in the composition of exports in India, and that change is because of these export promotion schemes. In the export promotion schemes also, higher importance was given to import of technology which will facilitate us to produce the goods ourselves. And latter half of the sixth plan was the phase where higher importance was given for technological upgradation higher importance was given for technological upgradation and increasing the base of manufacturing units so that the production will be increased. And this is in relation to the exports. So those goods which are being exported and which have been the earners of foreign exchange, they will be given exemption in technological upgradation, and they will be given encouragement in technological upgradation. They will be given incentives for increasing their manufacturing units as well as for increasing their production base. In this way, with these reasons, the export mechanism of India can be divided into these three phases. Now let me explain some export promotion schemes as well as on what reasons such export promotion schemes were introduced in India. I hope you understood these three phases. The three phases explain you that here passive exports, but the 1966 devaluation of rupee as well as oil shock of 1973 gave an encouragement to the exports of India. So this is increase in exports with promotional schemes. Next, latter half of sixth plan. From here onwards, the imports rose further. The reason is concentrating on technological upgradation, concentrating on technological upgradation and production base diversification. These three phases are characterized by these three effects, and attributed to these three effects there was a change in the composition of exports of India since the independence.